The silk of her wedding gown clung like chains as Cordelia Fairfax lifted her trembling hand during the ceremony, her voice cutting through the chapel's oppressive silence like a blade. "I cannot marry this man." The words shattered 20 years of careful breeding and 3 months of wedding preparations. Lord Ashworth's mask of civility cracked, revealing the monster beneath as his fingers bruised her wrist. But Cordelia had seen too much, learned too much about his first wife's mysterious death to walk willingly into his trap. Rain lashed her face as she fled into the storm, her elaborate gown dragging through mud and her future crumbling with each desperate step. Then strong hands caught her falling form, and she looked up through the downpour into the dark, knowing eyes of Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow. "Miss Fairfax," he said quietly, his voice a lifeline in the chaos, "my carriage awaits. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you." The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Fairfax Manor, casting long shadows across the faded grandeur of what had once been Hampshire's most elegant estate. In the largest bedchamber on the second floor, Miss Cordelia Fairfax stood motionless before her mirror, a vision of bridal perfection that belied the terror coursing through her veins. The wedding gown that enveloped her slender frame was a masterpiece of ivory silk and Belgian lace, its intricate beadwork catching the sunlight like dewdrops on spider's silk. Each pearl had been hand-sewn, each fold of fabric carefully arranged to create the illusion of innocence and purity that society demanded of its brides. Yet as Cordelia stared at her reflection, all she could see was a lamb dressed for slaughter, her hollow eyes betraying the fear that no amount of powder and paint could conceal. Her dark hair had been arranged in an elaborate coiffure, threaded with orange blossoms that should have symbolized hope, but instead felt like funeral flowers. The stays of her corset were laced so tightly she could barely breathe, a fitting metaphor for the suffocating future that awaited her in 3 days' time when she would become Lady Ashworth, wife to a man whose very name made her blood run cold. The gown itself was worth more than her father's estate had earned in the past 2 years. A gift from her intended husband that served as both blessing and curse, for it represented not generosity, but possession. A claim staked upon her body before the vows had even been spoken. "Oh, Cordelia, you look absolutely divine," exclaimed her younger sister Genevieve, as she burst into the chamber with all the enthusiasm of a puppy, her golden curls bouncing with each excited step. The contrast between the sisters was striking, for where Cordelia possessed a quiet, thoughtful beauty that revealed itself slowly to those who took the time to look, Genevieve sparkled like sunlight on water, all bright laughter and easy smiles that had never known the weight of true responsibility. At 19, she remained blissfully unaware of the family's dire financial straits, protected by Cordelia's careful shielding and their father's desperate attempts to maintain appearances. "I do believe you shall be the most beautiful bride Hampshire has ever seen," Genevieve continued, clapping her hands together in delight. "Lord Ashworth is so very fortunate to be gaining such a treasure. Oh, do turn around so I might see how the train falls." The poor child had no idea that her sister's marriage was not a romantic triumph, but a business transaction, a bartering of flesh for coin that would save the family from complete ruin while condemning Cordelia to a living hell. Mrs. Temperance Mills, their former governess who had remained with the family despite their reduced circumstances, stood silently near the window, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she observed Cordelia's pallor and the way her hands trembled despite her efforts at composure. The older woman had served the Fairfax family for 15 years, first as teacher to the girls and now as companion and confidant, and she possessed the rare gift of seeing beyond surface appearances to the truth that lay beneath. Mrs. Mills approached with the measured steps of one who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of a household in decline, her practical grey dress and neat cap reflecting her position as neither family nor servant, but something in between. "My dear," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of one who had guided both sisters through childhood's trials, "perhaps you should rest for a moment. You look rather pale this morning." The concern in her tone was unmistakable, though she was too well trained to speak openly of her fears in front of Genevieve, who remained mercifully oblivious to the undercurrents of tension that filled the room like smoke. Cordelia met Mrs. Mills' gaze in the mirror, seeing her own worry reflected in those kind grey eyes that had witnessed too much to be easily deceived. "I am quite well," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. Merely excited about the upcoming celebration, as any bride should be. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she had become adept at swallowing such falsehoods in recent weeks, each one a small death that brought her closer to the larger destruction that awaited. Genevieve, bless her innocent heart, accepted this explanation without question, launching into an animated description of the wedding breakfast menu and the elaborate decorations that Lord Ashworth had commissioned for his private chapel. Each detail another bar in the cage that was closing around Cordelia with inexorable finality. The sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor announced her father's arrival before he appeared in the doorway, his once handsome face bearing the marks of too many sleepless nights and too much brandy consumed in desperate attempts to forget his failures. Sir Edmund Fairfax had been a proud man once, the master of a thriving estate, and the father of 2 daughters who wanted for nothing, but years of poor investments and gambling debts had reduced him to a shadow of his former self, dependent upon the charity of his creditors and the promise of his eldest daughter's advantageous marriage to save them all from complete disgrace. "Girls," he announced, his voice carrying forced cheer that fooled no one except perhaps Genevieve, "I bring excellent news from Lord Ashworth. The wedding ceremony has been moved from St. Mary's to his lordship's private chapel at Ashworth Hall, a most generous gesture that will ensure a more intimate and elegant affair." The words struck Cordelia like physical blows, each syllable confirming her worst fears about her intended husband's true intentions. A private chapel meant no curious villagers, no witnesses beyond those carefully chosen by Lord Ashworth himself, no possibility of intervention should something go terribly wrong during the ceremony or the wedding night that would follow. She had heard the whispered stories about his first wife, poor Lady Margaret, who had died so mysteriously young, her body found at the bottom of the stairs in Ashworth Hall's east wing with injuries that could have been explained by a fall, but which some claimed bore the marks of more deliberate violence. "How wonderful!" Genevieve exclaimed, clapping her hands together in delight, while remaining blissfully unaware of the true implications of this change in venue. "A private ceremony will be so much more romantic, will it not, Cordelia?" Her sister's innocent enthusiasm felt like salt in an open wound, for how could she explain that romance had nothing to do with this arrangement, that Lord Ashworth's interest in privacy stemmed not from devotion, but from a desire to conduct his business away from prying eyes and wagging tongues. Indeed, Cordelia managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the thundering of her own heart. "Most thoughtful of his lordship." She caught Mrs. Mills' sharp intake of breath and saw the flash of alarm that crossed the older woman's features before training reasserted itself, and her expression returned to careful neutrality. But the damage was done, for Mrs. Mills understood as well as Cordelia what this development truly meant. Sir Edmund, either oblivious to his daughter's distress or choosing to ignore it in favor of maintaining the fiction that this marriage was anything other than a financial transaction, continued with forced enthusiasm about the arrangements Lord Ashworth had made, the elaborate feast that would follow the ceremony, and the generous settlement that would restore the Fairfax family's fortune and reputation. Each word fell like another stone into the well of Cordelia's despair. Yet she maintained her composure with the skill of one who had learned early that survival often depended upon hiding one's true feelings behind a mask of compliance and grace. The wedding gown that had seemed so beautiful when first delivered now felt like a burial shroud, its weight pressing down upon her shoulders like the expectations of a society that valued her beauty and breeding above her happiness or her very life. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across her chamber floor, Cordelia found herself alone at last with Mrs. Mills, Genevieve having departed to practice her piano pieces for the wedding entertainment, and her father having retreated to his study to nurse his brandy and his conscience in private. The silence stretched between the two women like a bridge neither dared to cross, for what was there to say that would change anything now, with the contracts signed and the settlements agreed upon, and Lord Ashworth's ring already claiming its place upon Cordelia's finger? "My dear child," Mrs. Mills finally spoke, her voice heavy with all the words she could not say, all the warnings she could not voice without risking her position and perhaps Cordelia's safety as well. "You know that I have always held your welfare above all other considerations." The older woman's hands twisted in her skirts as she struggled with the boundaries of her position, torn between her duty to remain silent and her growing certainty that her beloved charge was walking toward destruction. Cordelia turned from the mirror where she had been standing like a statue, her reflection showing a young woman aged beyond her years by the weight of knowledge too terrible to bear alone. "I know, Mrs. Mills," she replied softly, grateful for the woman's unspoken understanding. "And I know that you have observed much in these past weeks, as have I." The two women's eyes met in perfect comprehension, for they had both seen the bruises on the kitchen maid's wrists after Lord Ashworth's last visit. Both heard the whispered stories about his treatment of servants who displeased him. Both noted the way he looked at Cordelia, not with love or even desire, but with the calculating gaze of a man appraising his newest acquisition. Mrs. Mills stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she spoke words that could destroy them both if overheard. "The choice is yours alone to make, my dear. But know that whatever you decide, I shall stand by you as I have always done, regardless of the consequences to myself or my position here." The offer was both generous and terrifying, for it placed the full weight of decision upon Cordelia's shoulders, while offering the precious gift of understanding and support that she had thought lost forever. That night, as rain began to fall against the windows of Fairfax Manor like tears from a morning sky, Cordelia sat in her nightgown reading and rereading the entries in her late mother's journal that she had discovered hidden behind a loose board in the escritoire. The elegant handwriting spoke of concerns about the Ashworth family, of whispered warnings from other ladies about Lord Phineas's character, of fears for any woman unlucky enough to fall into his power. Her mother had written these words 15 years ago, when Lord Ashworth was merely a young man with a reputation for cruelty toward animals and servants, before his marriage to Lady Margaret had given him access to a helpless wife upon whom to practice his darker inclinations. "If only I had found these pages sooner," Cordelia thought, as tears fell upon the faded ink. But perhaps it would have made no difference, for her father's debts were real and his desperation genuine, and in their world a daughter's happiness was always secondary to a family's survival. Yet as she sat there in the candlelight, surrounded by the evidence of Lord Ashworth's true nature, Cordelia felt something stirring within her that had been dormant for too long. A spark of rebellion that refused to be extinguished by duty or fear or the crushing weight of expectation. She thought of Lady Margaret, young and beautiful and trusting, who had walked willingly into Ashworth Hall and never walked out again. And she knew with crystalline clarity that she could not, would not, allow herself to become another victim of a man whose wealth and position protected him from consequences while his wives paid the ultimate price for his monstrous appetites. The decision crystallized in her mind like ice forming on a winter pond, clear and unbreakable and cold as death itself. She would not marry Lord Phineas Ashworth, regardless of the cost to her family's reputation or her own future, for some fates were worse than social ruin, and some prices too high to pay even for love of those who depended upon her sacrifice. The dawn of her wedding day arrived with the sound of rain lashing against the windows of Fairfax Manor, each drop striking the glass like tiny fists demanding entry to witness the tragedy about to unfold within. Cordelia woke not from peaceful slumber, but from the restless half-sleep of the condemned, her body rigid with tension, and her mind already calculating the hours, minutes, and seconds that remained before she would be expected to walk down the aisle toward her destruction. The grey light filtering through the storm clouds cast everything in shades of mourning, as if the very heavens wept for what was to come, and she found herself wondering if this was how Lady Margaret had felt on her own wedding morning 15 years ago, whether she too had awakened to the sound of rain and the knowledge that she was about to surrender her life to a monster disguised as a gentleman. The household had been stirring since before dawn, servants scurrying through the corridors with armfuls of flowers and wedding finery, their excited chatter a cruel counterpoint to the dread that filled Cordelia's heart like poison. She could hear Mrs. Henderson, the cook, directing the preparation of the wedding breakfast with military precision, her voice carrying from the kitchens as she orchestrated what should have been a celebration, but felt instead like a funeral feast. From the adjoining chamber came the sound of Genevieve's laughter, bright and musical and utterly oblivious to the horror that was about to unfold, and Cordelia felt her heart break a little more with each note of her sister's innocent joy. Rising from her bed like a spectre, Cordelia moved to the window and pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching the rain streak down in rivulets that reminded her of tears. How fitting that the weather should match her mood, she thought bitterly, for if she had possessed the power to command the elements, she would have summoned a tempest fierce enough to wash away Ashworth Hall and its master with it, to make the very earth swallow up this wedding and everyone who would benefit from her misery. But she was only a woman, powerless and dependent, raised to be ornamental rather than useful, trained in accomplishments that would please a husband rather than skills that might allow her to survive independently in a world that offered few alternatives to marriage for ladies of her station. The irony was not lost upon her that her education, designed to make her an appealing bride, had also given her the intelligence to understand exactly what fate awaited her, and the imagination to envision, in vivid detail, the years of suffering that stretched ahead like a road leading inexorably toward death. She thought of her mother's journal, hidden now beneath her mattress like contraband, its pages filled with warnings that had come 15 years too late to save Lady Margaret, but might yet serve to illuminate the truth for anyone brave enough to look upon it. The storm outside seemed to intensify as if responding to her thoughts, the wind howling around the manor's ancient stones with a voice that sounded almost human in its anguish, and Cordelia found herself wondering if this was Lady Margaret's spirit trying to warn her, trying to prevent another young woman from walking willingly into the trap that had claimed her own life. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of the wedding party's support staff, and within moments her chamber was invaded by a small army of maids and seamstresses, their arms laden with the components of her bridal ensemble. The wedding gown hung on its stand like an empty shell, waiting to be filled with her reluctant flesh, its ivory silk gleaming despite the grey morning light. as if it possessed some inner radiance that mocked the darkness of the occasion. Mrs. Patterson, the head seamstress borrowed from Lady Worthington for this special day, bustled about with professional efficiency, her hands gentle but impersonal as she began the process of transforming Cordelia from a woman into a bride, each layer of silk and lace another step in the ritual that would culminate in her legal bondage to Lord Ashworth. The corset came first, its whalebone stays designed to create the fashionable silhouette that men found so appealing, its tight lacings a preview of the constraints that marriage would place upon her freedom, her breath, her very existence. As the maid pulled the stays tighter, Cordelia found herself thinking that this was what it must feel like to be buried alive, to feel the walls of the tomb closing in while consciousness remained to witness every moment of the entombment. The chemise followed. Then the stockings and garters, each item of clothing chosen not for her comfort, but for its symbolic value, its contribution to the image of purity and innocence that society demanded of its brides, regardless of the corruption that might await them at the altar. Genevieve burst into the chamber like a ray of sunshine piercing storm clouds, her arms full of orange blossoms and her face glowing with excitement that seemed to illuminate the entire room despite the gloomy weather outside. "Oh, Cordelia," she exclaimed as she arranged the flowers with artistic flair. "You cannot imagine how beautiful everything looks downstairs. The drawing-room has been transformed into a perfect bower, and cook has outdone herself with the wedding breakfast. Lord Ashworth sent the most exquisite champagne, and Papa is beside himself with joy at the thought of toasting your happiness." Her words fell upon Cordelia's ears like stones thrown into a deep well, each cheerful observation sinking into the darkness of her despair without creating even the smallest ripple of response. How could she tell this beloved sister that there would be no happiness to toast, that the man they were celebrating was a monster who viewed marriage as a license for cruelty, that the beautiful flowers Genevieve arranged so lovingly would soon become funeral wreaths, marking the death of everything Cordelia had ever hoped to be? The poor child continued her chatter as she helped the maids arrange Cordelia's hair, weaving the orange blossoms through the dark tresses with fingers that trembled slightly with excitement, utterly unconscious of the fact that she was helping to prepare her sister for sacrifice. Mrs. Mills appeared in the doorway like a guardian angel, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with the penetrating gaze of one who missed nothing and understood too much. Her presence brought a measure of comfort to Cordelia, for here at least was someone who might comprehend the true nature of what was taking place, someone whose concern was genuine rather than performative. "My dear child," Mrs. Mills said softly as she approached the dressing table where Cordelia sat like a porcelain doll being prepared for display, "perhaps you might benefit from a moment of quiet reflection before the ceremony." The suggestion was delivered with the careful neutrality of one who walked always on dangerous ground, who knew that too much insight or too obvious concern might be interpreted as interference by those who held the power to dismiss her without reference or pension. Cordelia met her gaze in the looking-glass, seeing her own fear reflected in those kind grey eyes that had watched over her since childhood, and felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who had sacrificed her own opportunities for independence to remain with a family in decline, who had chosen loyalty over security and love over comfort. Mrs. Mill's presence was a reminder that there were still people in the world who valued honor above convenience, who understood that some bonds transcended mere duty or financial obligation, and for a moment Cordelia felt less alone with her terrible knowledge. "That sounds perfectly sensible," she managed to reply, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "Perhaps a few minutes to compose myself before the guests arrive." Genevieve looked up from her flower arranging with the expression of mild concern, her innocent face reflecting worry that her sister might be suffering from the natural nervousness of any bride, rather than the existential terror of one who knew herself to be walking toward destruction. Mrs. Mills dismissed the other servants with quiet authority, sending them about their duties with instructions to ensure that everything was perfect for the ceremony, and soon the chamber contained only the 3 women who had shared so many years together within these walls. The silence that fell was heavy with unspoken understanding, for while Genevieve remained blissfully unaware of the true situation, Mrs. Mills had seen enough in recent weeks to draw her own conclusions about Lord Ashworth's character and her dear Cordelia's state of mind. "Cordelia," she said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of one who understood that lives might hang in the balance of what was said or left unsaid. "I want you to know that whatever choices you might feel compelled to make, whatever decisions might seem necessary for the welfare of those you love, you have my complete support and understanding." The words were carefully coded, designed to offer comfort without providing grounds for accusation, should they be overheard or reported, but their meaning was crystal clear to Cordelia, who felt tears spring to her eyes at this evidence of unwavering loyalty from the woman who had been more mother to her than governess. Genevieve looked between them with growing puzzlement, sensing undercurrents she could not comprehend but had not yet learned to fear, her natural optimism protecting her from the darker truths that shadowed her sister's existence. The morning progressed with relentless efficiency, each task completed bringing Cordelia closer to the moment when she would be expected to take Lord Ashworth's arm and speak the vows that would bind her to him until death freed her from the bondage. The wedding dress slipped over her head like a shroud, its weight settling upon her shoulders with the finality of a prison gate closing, and she watched in the mirror as her reflection transformed from that of Cordelia Fairfax, free woman, into that of a bride prepared for sacrifice. The jewelry came next. Lord Ashworth's gifts arranged upon her throat and wrists like golden chains, their weight a constant reminder of the price he expected to extract in return for his generosity. The emerald necklace felt particularly heavy against her skin, its stones cold as winter ice and somehow watching, as if they carried within them the accumulated suffering of all the women who had worn them before her. She thought of Lady Margaret adorning herself with these same jewels on her own wedding morning, perhaps feeling this same sense of impending doom, perhaps entertaining the same wild thoughts of flight that now consumed Cordelia's every waking moment. The tiara settled upon her head like a crown of thorns, its diamonds catching what little light penetrated the storm clouds and throwing it back in fractured rainbows that seemed to mock the darkness of the occasion. Mrs. Mills busied herself with small adjustments to the gown's train, her movements precise but her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the silk and arranged the lace, and Cordelia knew that the older woman was struggling with her own demons, torn between her duty to remain silent and her desperate desire to warn, to protect, to somehow prevent the tragedy that seemed as inevitable as the rising of the sun. The sound of carriages arriving in the courtyard below announced the arrival of the wedding guests, their voices carrying through the rain as they hurried toward the shelter of the manor's entrance hall. And Cordelia felt her heart begin to race as the reality of what was about to happen struck her with renewed force. Soon these people, friends and neighbors and distant relatives, would witness her destruction, would raise their glasses in toast to a union that would bring her nothing but suffering, would smile and congratulate her father on his successful negotiation of her future, while she stood beside her new husband like a prize cow sold at market. The thought filled her with such rage that for a moment she feared she might tear the wedding dress from her body and flee naked into the storm rather than submit to this charade. But training and breeding reasserted themselves, and she remained seated before her mirror like a statue carved from ice, beautiful and cold and utterly lifeless. The time had come to make her final choice, to decide once and for all whether she would walk meekly to her destruction or find the courage to defy everything she had been taught about duty and obedience and a woman's proper place in the world. The sound of her father's footsteps in the corridor announced that her moment of decision had arrived, and Cordelia felt something shift within her soul, some fundamental change that would alter the course of her life forever. She thought of Lady Margaret's journal, of the warnings unheeded, and the tragedy that had followed, and knew that she could not, would not, allow history to repeat itself through her own destruction. The die was cast, the decision made, and as Sir Edmund's knock sounded upon her chamber door, Cordelia Fairfax prepared to choose her own fate rather than submit to the one that had been chosen for her by men who valued her fortune above her life and her compliance above her happiness. Miles away from Fairfax Manor, in the elegant study of Ravenshollow Abbey, Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, sat before his mahogany desk reading a report that confirmed his worst fears about the man who was scheduled to marry Miss Cordelia Fairfax in mere hours. The document before him, compiled by his most trusted agent and delivered despite the storm that raged across Hampshire, contained information that made his blood run cold and his hands clench into fists that could have shattered crystal. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. A catalogue of cruelty that stretched back years and included not only the suspicious death of Lord Ashworth's first wife, but a pattern of abuse toward servants, tenants, and anyone else unfortunate enough to fall under his power. There were testimonies from former household staff who had fled Ashworth Hall in terror, accounts from local magistrates who had been pressured to overlook certain incidents, and most damaging of all, a physician's private notes describing injuries to Lady Margaret that were inconsistent with the accidental fall that had officially caused her death. Alexander had suspected much of this already, for Lord Ashworth's reputation among those who moved in the darker circles of London society was well established. But to see it laid out in such stark detail filled him with a rage that threatened to overwhelm his normally iron self-control. The man was a monster, plain and simple, and the thought that an innocent young woman was about to be delivered into his hands like a lamb to slaughter made Alexander's very soul cry out for justice. He had been haunted by thoughts of Miss Cordelia Fairfax for weeks now, ever since their brief encounter at the village fair, where he had observed her quiet grace and intelligent eyes. The way she had positioned herself between her younger sister and a group of rowdy young bucks who had been making inappropriate advances. There had been something in her manner that had spoken to him on a level deeper than mere attraction, a recognition of a kindred spirit trapped by circumstances beyond her control. And he had found himself making discreet inquiries about her situation that had led inevitably to this moment of terrible knowledge. The investigation had begun as idle curiosity about an interesting young woman, but had quickly transformed into something far more urgent as the true nature of her impending marriage became clear. Alexander knew what it meant to fail someone who depended upon your protection, for the guilt of his sister Charlotte's death still weighed upon his conscience like lead, a constant reminder of what happened when duty and convention were allowed to override human decency. Charlotte had been barely 18 when he had arranged her marriage to the Earl of Westbrook, a man of impeccable reputation and substantial fortune who had seemed the perfect choice for a duke's sister, and she had died within 2 years of the wedding under circumstances that had never been fully explained. The official cause had been influenza, but Alexander had always suspected that his sister's fragile constitution had been weakened by something more insidious than disease, some poison of the spirit that had consumed her from within until she had simply given up the fight to live. The storm outside seemed to intensify as Alexander contemplated his options, the wind howling around the ancient stones of his ancestral home with a voice that sounded almost human in its anguish, and he found himself thinking that perhaps the very elements were protesting the injustice that was about to unfold at Ashworth Hall. He could not legally intervene, for he had no standing in the matter and no authority to prevent a marriage between consenting parties. But neither could he sit idly by while another innocent woman walked willingly into the same trap that had claimed his sister's life. The rational part of his mind argued that Miss Fairfax's fate was not his responsibility, that he barely knew the woman and had no obligation to risk his own reputation or safety for her sake. But the deeper part of his soul, the part that still grieved for Charlotte's lost laughter and gentle spirit, knew that he could not live with himself if he failed to act when action was still possible. His man of business had included in the report a detailed schedule of the wedding day's events, information gathered from servants and tradespeople who had been involved in the preparations, and Alexander studied these details with the strategic mind that had made him one of the most successful landowners in England. The ceremony was to take place at Lord Ashworth's private chapel rather than the village church, a detail that sent ice through Alexander's veins as he contemplated the implications, for it meant that Miss Fairfax would be completely under her future husband's control from the moment she entered his property, with no witnesses beyond those he had chosen and no possibility of intervention from concerned neighbours or clergy. Alexander called for his valet and his carriage to be prepared immediately, his decision crystallizing as he considered the geography of the situation and the timing of the storm that might provide both cover and opportunity for whatever intervention he might attempt. He would position himself near Ashworth Hall under the pretext of seeking shelter from the weather, a reasonable excuse for any nobleman caught travelling in such conditions, and from there he would observe the proceedings and be ready to act should the opportunity arise. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success and significant risk to his own reputation should his true motives be discovered. But Alexander had learned that sometimes desperate measures were the only ones that offered any hope of preventing tragedy. He thought of Miss Fairfax as he had last seen her, standing in the village square with her head held high despite the obvious strain of her circumstances, her dark eyes holding depths of intelligence and compassion that deserved so much better than the fate that awaited her, and he knew that he would rather risk everything than live with the knowledge that he had done nothing to prevent another Charlotte from sacrificing herself upon the altar of duty and social expectation. The rain continued to lash against his study windows as if the very heavens were weeping for what was to come, and Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, prepared to ride into the storm in a desperate attempt to prevent a tragedy that would haunt him for the rest of his days if he failed to act. The ancient stones of St. Bartholomew's Chapel seemed to press inward as Cordelia stood at the threshold, her hand resting upon her father's trembling arm, while the weight of destiny settled upon her shoulders like a shroud. The private chapel at Ashworth Hall had been transformed for the occasion into something that might have appeared magnificent to those who did not understand its true purpose, its Gothic arches draped with white silk and orange blossoms that filled the air with a cloying sweetness that made her stomach turn. The assembled guests, a carefully curated selection of Lord Ashworth's allies and her father's remaining friends, turned in their seats to watch her entrance, with expressions that ranged from polite interest to barely concealed anticipation, as if they had come not to witness a wedding, but to observe the final act of a tragedy that had been building for months. The storm that raged beyond the stained glass windows cast shifting patterns of coloured light across the stone floor, and Cordelia found herself thinking that even the saints depicted in those ancient panes seemed to weep for what was about to unfold within these consecrated walls. Her wedding gown, so beautiful in the gentle light of her chamber, now felt like a costume designed for a role she had never auditioned for but could no longer refuse to play, its train dragging behind her like the weight of all the women who had walked this path before her and paid the ultimate price for their compliance. The organ music that should have filled her heart with joy instead sounded like a funeral dirge, each note echoing off the vaulted ceiling with a solemnity that made her blood run cold as ice in her veins. At the altar stood Lord Phineas Ashworth in his finest attire, his tall frame draped in black velvet and silver brocade that made him appear more undertaker than bridegroom, his pale eyes fixed upon her approaching figure with an intensity that made her skin crawl despite the distance that still separated them. The smile that played about his thin lips held no warmth or affection, but rather the satisfaction of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey after a long and patient hunt, and Cordelia felt her steps falter as she recognized the look of ownership that gleamed in those cold depths. This was not a man preparing to welcome a beloved wife, but a collector admiring his newest acquisition, and she realized with crystal clarity that whatever small hope she might have harbored that marriage might somehow transform him into a decent husband had been nothing more than desperate self-deception. The Reverend Dr. Thornbury stood between them like a figure carved from stone, his aged face bearing the grave expression of one who performed this duty not from joy but from obligation, and Cordelia wondered if he too sensed something wrong with this union, or if his solemnity was merely the result of decades spent presiding over ceremonies that bound souls together for better or worse. Sir Edmund's grip upon her arm tightened as they drew nearer to the altar, whether from nervousness or determination she could not tell, but she felt the tremor in his fingers, and knew that whatever else might be said about her father's failures, he was not entirely without conscience regarding what he was asking her to sacrifice for the family's salvation. The congregation settled into expectant silence as Cordelia took her place beside Lord Ashworth, the rustle of silk and whispered conversations fading away until only the sound of rain against stone remained to mark the passage of time. She could feel his presence beside her like a cold draught from an open tomb, could smell the sharp scent of bergamot, and something darker that clung to his clothing like an invisible miasma. And when he reached for her gloved hand, she had to fight every instinct that screamed at her to pull away and run. His fingers closed over hers with possessive strength, and she felt the cold metal of his signet ring press against her skin through the delicate kid skin of her gloves, a preview of the bands that would soon circle her finger like shackles forged from gold and blessed by the church. Dr. Thornbury opened his prayer book with hands that seemed steadier than her own, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel as he began the ancient words that had bound countless couples throughout the centuries, words that should have filled her with hope and joy, but instead felt like an incantation summoning demons from the depths of hell. Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony, which is an honorable estate instituted of God himself. The irony was not lost upon her that the ceremony spoke of honor when what was taking place was anything but honorable, that it invoked God's blessing upon a union that seemed cursed from its very inception. As the liturgy continued with its familiar cadences, Cordelia felt her mind beginning to drift away from the present moment, seeking refuge in memories of happier times when the future had seemed filled with possibility rather than dread. She thought of her mother, dead these 10 years, but still present in her heart, wondering what advice that gentle soul would have given if she had lived to see this day. Would she have counseled obedience and resignation, reminding her daughter that a woman's duty was always to her family's welfare above her own happiness? Or would she have found some way to prevent this travesty from taking place at all? The Reverend's voice continued to wash over her like waves upon a distant shore as he spoke of the purposes of marriage, of mutual society and comfort, and the procreation of children, and Cordelia felt bile rise in her throat at the thought of bearing Lord Ashworth's offspring, of bringing innocent souls into the world only to watch them learn to fear their own father as she already feared the man whose name she was about to take. The emeralds at her throat felt heavier with each passing moment, their weight pressing down upon her collarbones like a stone reminder of all the women who had worn these jewels before her, and she wondered if Lady Margaret had felt this same sense of impending doom as she stood in this very spot 15 years ago, speaking vows that would ultimately lead to her destruction. The moment she had been dreading arrived with the inevitability of dawn breaking over a battlefield, as Dr. Thornbury's voice rose slightly to deliver the words that would seal her fate if she allowed them to pass unchallenged. Therefore, if any man can show any just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. The silence that followed was so complete that Cordelia could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the expectant tension of the assembled guests as they waited for this formality to pass so that the ceremony could continue toward its predetermined conclusion. This was her moment, she realized with startling clarity. Her last chance to speak before the vows were exchanged, and her life became forfeit to a man who would view her as property to be used and discarded at his pleasure. She opened her mouth to speak, to cry out against this travesty, to demand that someone acknowledge the truth about the monster who stood beside her, wearing the mask of respectability. But no sound emerged from her throat except a small gasp that might have been mistaken for nervousness rather than terror. Years of conditioning, of being taught that a lady never made scenes or caused discomfort to others, rose up to strangle the words before they could be born, and she felt despair wash over her as the precious seconds ticked away. And still she remained silent. Dr. Thornbury waited what seemed like an eternity before nodding slightly and turning his attention to the groom, his voice taking on the formal tone required for the exchange of vows that would bind them together until death provided the only possible escape. "Phineas Arthur Ashworth," he intoned, "wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep thee only unto her so long as ye both shall live?" The words were a mockery, Cordelia thought with growing hysteria, for this man knew nothing of love or comfort or honor, and the very idea of him promising to cherish and protect her was so absurd as to be almost laughable if the situation had not been so desperately tragic. Lord Ashworth's response rang out clear and strong, his "I will" carrying none of the emotion that such a moment should inspire, but rather the satisfaction of a businessman concluding a particularly favorable negotiation. Then the Reverend's attention turned to her, and Cordelia felt the weight of every gaze in the chapel pressing down upon her as he prepared to ask the question that would require her to speak her own destruction. "Cordelia." "Margaret Fairfax," de Thornbury continued, his voice gentle but inexorable, "wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou obey him and serve him, love, honor and keep him, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others keep thee only unto him, so long as ye both shall live?" The words hung in the air between them like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads, and Cordelia felt time itself seem to slow as she stood on the precipice of a decision that would determine the entire course of her remaining years. She thought of Lady Margaret's journal hidden beneath her mattress, of the warnings that had gone unheeded, and the tragedy that had followed. And suddenly she felt something shift deep within her soul. Some fundamental change that made it impossible for her to speak the lie that everyone expected to hear. The conditioning of 22 years fell away like chains breaking under unbearable pressure, and she found her voice at last, clear and strong and filled with a determination that surprised even her. "I cannot," she said, the words echoing through the chapel like thunder breaking the silence of a summer evening. "I cannot marry this man." The effect of her declaration was immediate and catastrophic, as if she had thrown a stone into a still pond and watched the ripples spread outward in ever-widening circles of shock and dismay. Gasps and exclamations erupted from the assembled guests, while Lord Ashworth's face transformed from smug satisfaction to furious disbelief, his pale eyes blazing with a rage so intense that Cordelia instinctively took a step backward. Dr. Thornbury stood frozen at the altar, his prayer book hanging forgotten in his hands as he stared at her in complete bewilderment, clearly uncertain how to proceed in the face of such an unprecedented situation. Sir Edmund made a strangled sound that might have been her name, or simply an expression of horror at the social catastrophe that was unfolding before his eyes, and Cordelia could see in his face the death of all his hopes for the family's financial salvation. But it was Lord Ashworth's reaction that truly terrified her, for his mask of civilized restraint had fallen away completely to reveal the monster that lurked beneath, and she realized that she was seeing the face that Lady Margaret must have known in private, the expression that had preceded whatever violence had ultimately claimed her life. "You will reconsider this foolishness immediately," Lord Ashworth hissed through clenched teeth, his hand shooting out to grasp her wrist with bruising force that made her gasp in pain and confirmed everything she had suspected about his true nature. "The guests are watching. Your father's reputation hangs in the balance, and you will not disgrace this family or mine with your hysterical behavior." His grip tightened with each word until she could feel her bones grinding together beneath his fingers, and she knew that this was just a preview of the pain he would inflict upon her if she gave him the legal right to call her his wife. She tried to pull away, but his strength was far greater than hers, and the desperation in his eyes told her that he would not release her easily, that too much depended upon this marriage for him to allow her to escape without a fight. The chapel erupted into chaos as guests began talking among themselves in urgent whispers, some rising from their seats as if uncertain whether to intervene or flee, and Cordelia realized that whatever happened next, her old life was over, and she would have to forge a new path through sheer force of will and courage she was not entirely certain she possessed. "My lord, please release my daughter," Sir Edmund said in a voice that shook with emotion, though whether from anger or fear Cordelia could not determine. "Perhaps we might discuss this matter privately and reach some understanding that would be satisfactory to all parties involved." But even as he spoke the words, Cordelia could see in his eyes that he knew the situation was beyond salvage, that no amount of negotiation or persuasion would undo the damage that had been done to all their reputations by her public refusal. Lord Ashworth's laugh was harsh and bitter as he responded, his grip on her wrist never loosening, despite her continued struggles to break free. "There is nothing to discuss, Sir Edmund, for your daughter has just provided ample demonstration of her unfitness to be my wife. But she will learn obedience, I assure you, for the contracts have been signed and the settlements agreed upon, and I will not be made a fool of by a headstrong chit who thinks herself above her station." The threats implicit in his words chilled Cordelia's blood, even as they strengthened her resolve, for she understood now that there could be no compromise, no middle ground between submission and destruction. This man would never forgive her defiance, would spend the rest of her life making her pay for this moment of rebellion, and she knew with absolute certainty that her only choice was to fight or die trying. With a strength born of desperation, Cordelia wrenched herself free from Lord Ashworth's grasp and gathered up her heavy skirts, running toward the chapel door while chaos erupted behind her. She could hear voices calling her name, some pleading, some commanding, but she did not look back as she burst through the doors into the raging storm that waited beyond the false sanctuary of the chapel walls. The rain struck her face like icy needles as she ran blindly across the courtyard, her elaborate wedding gown becoming heavier with each step as the silk absorbed the falling water and the mud splattered across the pristine white fabric like blood across snow. The wind howled around her with such force that it threatened to knock her from her feet, and she realized that she had fled from one form of destruction only to face another as nature itself seemed determined to claim her life. Her slippers, designed for dancing rather than running, provided no purchase on the slippery stones of the courtyard, and she felt herself beginning to stumble as exhaustion and terror combined to sap her strength. The weight of the waterlogged dress dragged at her legs like chains, and she knew that she could not continue much longer before the storm claimed what Lord Ashworth had been denied. Just as her strength finally failed, and she felt herself falling toward the unforgiving ground, a strong hand caught her arm and steadied her against the storm's fury. She looked up through the rain that streamed down her face like tears to see the dark, concerned eyes of Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, his own clothing soaked through, but his expression filled with understanding and determination that made her heart leap with sudden hope. "Miss Fairfax," he said quietly, his voice somehow carrying clearly despite the wind that raged around them. "My carriage awaits." The simple words offered salvation from a situation that had seemed hopeless, and Cordelia felt tears of relief mingle with the rain on her cheeks as she realized that perhaps, just perhaps, she might survive this day after all. Without hesitation, she placed her trust in this man who had appeared like an angel of mercy at the moment when all seemed lost, allowing him to guide her toward the dark carriage that waited like a refuge from the storm that threatened to consume them both. The interior of the Duke's carriage enveloped Cordelia like a cocoon of warmth and safety, its rich burgundy leather seats and polished wood trim speaking of wealth and refinement that made her acutely aware of her own bedraggled state as rainwater dripped from her sodden wedding gown onto the immaculate upholstery. The storm that raged outside seemed muffled and distant now, reduced to a gentle drumming against the carriage windows that was almost soothing after the violence of her flight from the chapel, and she found herself shivering, not just from the cold that had seeped into her bones, but from the delayed shock of what she had just done, the magnitude of her defiance still too enormous to fully comprehend. Alexander Blackwood sat across from her with the careful distance of a gentleman who understood the delicacy of the situation, his dark eyes filled with concern, but his manner scrupulously proper, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together in this intimate space. He had removed his own greatcoat without ceremony and draped it around her shoulders before producing a thick woolen blanket from the carriage's storage compartments, his movements efficient and gentle as he ensured her comfort without making her feel more vulnerable than she already did. The scent of bergamot and sandalwood that clung to his coat was infinitely preferable to the cloying sweetness of the chapel flowers or the darker undertones she had detected in Lord Ashworth's presence, and she pulled the heavy fabric closer around her trembling form while trying to process the reality that she was here, alive and free, rather than bound forever to a monster who would have made every day of her remaining life a torment beyond imagining. "You are safe now, Miss Fairfax," Alexander said quietly, his voice pitched low and soothing as the carriage swayed gently over the rutted country roads that led away from Ashworth Hall and all its horrors. "Whatever your reasons for leaving that chapel, and I suspect they were compelling indeed. You need not fear pursuit or retribution while you are under my protection." His words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and Cordelia found herself believing him despite the chaos that still reigned in her thoughts. For there was something in his manner that spoke of strength tempered by honor, of power wielded in service of justice rather than personal gratification. She had heard whispers about the Duke of Ravenshollow in the drawing-rooms of Hampshire society, tales of his intelligence and integrity, his devotion to his estates and tenants, his tragic loss of a beloved sister who had died young and left him with a reputation for avoiding the marriage mart despite being one of England's most eligible bachelors. Looking at him now through eyes still blurred with tears and rainwater, she could see the shadows of old pain in his expression, the careful control of a man who had learned to guard his emotions carefully, lest they overwhelm him entirely. There was kindness in his face, she realized with dawning wonder, genuine compassion unmarred by the calculation or predatory hunger she had grown accustomed to seeing in the eyes of men who viewed women as commodities to be acquired and possessed, rather than human beings deserving of respect and protection. "I fear I have compromised you terribly by accepting your assistance," she managed to say through chattering teeth, her voice barely above a whisper as the full implications of her situation began to penetrate the fog of shock that had surrounded her since her desperate flight from the altar. "Society will assume the worst of both of us, and your reputation will suffer for your kindness to a woman who has brought disgrace upon herself and her family." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, for she knew the rigid codes that governed their world, understood that her presence in his carriage, unchaperoned, would be seen as scandalous regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together, and she could not bear the thought that her salvation might come at the cost of his social standing. Alexander's expression softened further at her concern for his welfare, even in the midst of her own crisis, and she saw something flicker in his dark eyes that might have been admiration for her consideration of others, despite her desperate circumstances. "My dear Miss Fairfax," he replied with gentle firmness, "my reputation has weathered far greater storms than this, and I care infinitely more for your safety and well-being than for the opinions of those who would condemn an act of common decency. Besides," he added with a slight smile that transformed his austere features, "I suspect that once the full truth of Lord Ashworth's character becomes known, as I intend to ensure it does, public opinion will vindicate your decision rather than condemn it." As the carriage continued its journey through the storm-lashed countryside, Cordelia found herself gradually able to speak of the events that had led to her dramatic escape, the words tumbling out in fits and starts as she described her growing horror at discovering Lord Ashworth's true nature through whispered warnings from servants, her mother's journal, and her own careful observations of his behavior toward those who could not defend themselves. Alexander listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each revelation about the man who had so nearly succeeded in claiming Cordelia as his victim, and she could see the controlled fury building behind his carefully maintained composure as she spoke of Lady Margaret's suspicious death, and the pattern of cruelty that suggested her own fate would have been equally tragic. When she finished her account, silence fell between them except for the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and wheels against stone, and Cordelia found herself studying Alexander's profile as he gazed out at the rain-soaked landscape with an expression of such profound sadness that her heart ached in sympathy for whatever memories her story had awakened. "Your courage in refusing to proceed with that marriage may well have saved your life," he said finally, his voice roughened by emotion that he struggled to keep in check. "I have some experience with the devastating consequences of failing to prevent such unions, and I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you found the strength to choose your own path rather than submit to a fate that would have destroyed you." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with such tragedy, and Cordelia felt a surge of curiosity about the shadows that haunted this enigmatic man who had appeared at her darkest moment like an answer to prayers she had not even known she was offering. "May I ask," she ventured carefully, "what experience you speak of, Your Grace? For surely a man of your position and influence has never been powerless to prevent such injustices from occurring." Alexander's hands tightened slightly on the leather strap he had been holding, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. But then he turned to meet her gaze, with eyes that held depths of pain she recognized all too well. "My younger sister Charlotte was married at 18 to a man I chose for her, a man whose reputation was spotless, and whose character I believed to be above reproach," he said quietly. "She died less than 2 years later, officially of influenza, but I have always suspected that her spirit was broken long before her body succumbed to disease. I failed her utterly by prioritizing social advantage over her happiness, and I have carried that guilt every day since her death." The raw honesty of his confession touched something deep within Cordelia's heart, for she understood now why he had been positioned to intervene in her own crisis, why his concern for her welfare went beyond mere chivalry to something more personal and profound. The landscape outside the carriage windows began to change as they travelled deeper into the duchy's lands, the wild moorland giving way to carefully tended parkland, where ancient oaks stood sentinel over rolling green meadows that even the storm could not diminish in their beauty. In the distance, Cordelia could see the towers and chimneys of what could only be Ravenshollow Abbey rising from a gentle hillside like something from a fairy tale, its Gothic architecture speaking of centuries of history and tradition that somehow managed to be welcoming rather than intimidating. The Abbey's windows glowed warmly against the grey afternoon, promising shelter and safety after the terrors of the morning, and Cordelia felt her heart lift slightly at the sight of this refuge that would provide her with time to think and plan her next steps without the immediate pressure of pursuit or social censure. As they drew nearer to the great house, she could see servants moving about their duties despite the weather, their purposeful activity suggesting a household run with efficiency and care rather than the harsh discipline she had observed at Ashworth Hall, and she began to allow herself to hope that perhaps her impulsive decision to trust this man had been justified by circumstances rather than mere desperations. The carriage swept through massive iron gates adorned with the Ravenshollow coat of arms and up a gravelled drive lined with lime trees whose branches formed a natural cathedral overhead, their leaves rustling with a sound like whispered blessings even in the storm's fury. Cordelia found herself pressing her face to the window like a child as they approached the Abbey's main entrance, marvelling at the way the ancient building seemed to embrace rather than intimidate, its honey-coloured stone walls softened by climbing roses and ivy that spoke of a place where beauty was cultivated alongside strength. The carriage drew to a halt before a massive oak door studded with iron, and within moments it opened to reveal a formidable woman in housekeeper's black, whose sharp eyes took in the situation with the swift assessment of one accustomed to managing crises with calm efficiency. "This would be Mrs. Catherine Whitmore," Alexander explained, as a footman hurried forward with an umbrella to shield them from the continuing rain. "My housekeeper and the true ruler of Ravenshollow Abbey. If anyone can restore you to rights after your ordeal, it is she." The warmth in his voice as he spoke of his staff told Cordelia much about his character as a master, for she had learned that the way a man treated his servants was often the truest measure of his nature, and the obvious affection and respect between the Duke and his household gave her hope that her instincts about his trustworthiness had been correct. Whitmore stepped forward with the dignity of a queen receiving guests at court, her manner managing to convey both sympathy for Cordelia's bedraggled state and complete confidence in her ability to remedy the situation without making her feel like an object of pity or charity. "Your Grace," she said to Alexander with a respectful curtsy. "Welcome home. And miss," she continued, turning to Cordelia with eyes that were kind despite their sharpness, "you look as though you could benefit from a warm bath, dry clothes, and a proper meal. If you will come with me, I shall see to your comfort immediately while His Grace attends to whatever business this weather may have brought to our door." Her tone brooked no argument while remaining perfectly courteous, and Cordelia found herself grateful for the woman's matter-of-fact approach to what could have been an embarrassing situation. For Mrs. Whitmore treated her neither as a fallen woman nor as a romantic heroine, but simply as a guest in need of care and assistance. As they crossed the threshold into Ravenshollow Abbey's great hall, Cordelia felt the weight of the morning's events begin to settle upon her shoulders like a physical burden. The adrenaline that had sustained her through her escape finally giving way to exhaustion and the dawning realization of how completely her life had changed in the space of a few terrifying hours. The interior of the abbey was as magnificent as its exterior had promised, with soaring stone arches and stained glass windows that cast jeweled light across polished floors despite the storm's gloom. But there was nothing cold or forbidding about the spaces through which Mrs. Whitmore led her with brisk efficiency. Fresh flowers adorned every table and mantel, comfortable chairs invited lingering, and the walls bore portraits and landscapes that spoke of a family's long and honorable history, rather than mere ostentation or pride. This was a home, Cordelia realized with something approaching wonder, a place where people lived and loved and found joy in simple pleasures rather than a monument to power and wealth designed to intimidate visitors into submission. As they climbed a magnificent staircase toward the guest chambers, she caught glimpses of other rooms through open doorways, each one furnished with the same combination of elegance and warmth that made her long to explore every corner of this sanctuary that had opened its doors to shelter her from the storm of her own making. Mrs. Whitmore kept up a gentle stream of conversation as they walked, her voice soothing and practical as she outlined the immediate plans for Cordelia's comfort. But underneath the housekeeper's professional competence, she sensed genuine kindness and concern that brought tears to her eyes after the coldness she had endured at Ashworth Hall. The bedchamber to which Mrs. Whitmore led her was a vision of comfort and tranquility, its windows overlooking gardens that would be spectacular when not obscured by driving rain, and Cordelia felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease as she was enveloped by an atmosphere of genuine hospitality. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls hung with watercolor landscapes, and the four-poster bed looked so inviting that she had to resist the urge to collapse upon it immediately, despite her sodden clothing. "Now then, my dear," Mrs. Whitmore said, as she began efficiently removing Cordelia's ruined wedding finery, "let us get you out of these wet things and into something more suitable for a proper young lady seeking refuge from a storm. I have taken the liberty of laying out some garments that should fit you tolerably well until your own clothes can be procured, and I shall have a bath drawn immediately so that you may warm yourself properly." The housekeeper's matter-of-fact kindness was like balm to Cordelia's wounded spirit, for she asked no uncomfortable questions and made no judgments about the circumstances that had brought a bride in wedding dress to their door in the middle of a thunderstorm, treating her instead with the same courtesy she would have shown to any guest who arrived in need of assistance. As the warm water was carried in and the copper tub filled before the fire, Cordelia found herself thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, her desperate gamble in trusting the Duke of Ravenshollow might prove to be the salvation she had never dared to hope for, rather than merely another form of imprisonment in a cage that happened to be gilded with kindness instead of cruelty to. The first light of dawn, breaking through the storm clouds, found Cordelia seated by the window of her guest chamber at Ravenshollow Abbey, wrapped in a borrowed morning dress of soft blue wool that belonged to Alexander's late sister, her dark hair loosely braided and her hands folded in her lap as she watched the sun attempt to pierce the lingering gloom of the previous day's tempest. Sleep had eluded her through most of the long night, her mind racing with the magnitude of what she had done, and the consequences that would surely follow, with the pitiless certainty of sunrise after darkness. And she found herself both grateful for her escape and terrified of the future that stretched before her like an unmarked path through treacherous wilderness. The comfort and safety of Ravenshollow had provided a respite from immediate danger. But she was not naive enough to believe that Lord Ashworth would simply accept her defection without attempting to reclaim what he considered his lawful property, and she knew that the morning would bring visitors and demands and legal complications that would test both her resolve and Alexander's commitment to protecting her from the storm she had unleashed. The sound of horses' hooves on gravel drew her attention to the drive below, where she could see a familiar black carriage bearing the Ashworth coat of arms approaching the Abbey's entrance with the ominous inevitability of a funeral procession. And her heart began to race as she realized that her former betrothed had come to collect his errant bride with all the authority that law and society could provide to support his claim. From the window she could observe Lord Ashworth's descent from his carriage, his tall frame rigid with barely controlled fury, and his pale face set in lines of such cold determination that even at this distance she could feel the malevolent force of his personality, like a dark miasma threatening to contaminate the peaceful atmosphere of the Abbey grounds. He was not alone, she noted with growing dread, for his carriage disgorged not only his personal servant, but also a man she recognized as Mr. Josiah Grimsby, a London solicitor with a reputation for ruthless pursuit of his client's interests, regardless of the human cost involved, and the presence of legal counsel suggested that Lord Ashworth intended to use every weapon at his disposal to force her return to his custody. The sight of these men approaching the sanctuary that had sheltered her through the night filled her with a terror so profound that she had to grip the window-sill to prevent herself from collapsing, for she understood that this confrontation would determine whether her desperate flight had been an act of heroic self-preservation or merely a postponement of an inevitable doom that would be all the more terrible for having been briefly delayed. She could hear voices in the entrance hall below, Alexander's calm and measured tones contrasting sharply with Lord Ashworth's clipped demands and Mr. Grimsby's officious pronouncements about legal obligations and contractual commitments, and she realized that her fate was being decided by men in a conversation from which she was excluded despite being its primary subject. Alexander had risen early to meet this challenge with the preparation and dignity befitting his position, and Cordelia had glimpsed him through her chamber door as he made his way to his study, dressed in formal morning attire that emphasized both his ducal authority and his personal strength, his dark hair perfectly arranged, and his expression set in lines of implacable resolve that reminded her powerfully of medieval portraits depicting noble warriors preparing for battle against overwhelming odds. His solicitor, Mr. Benedict Hartwell, had arrived even before Lord Ashworth's party, summoned by urgent message the previous evening to provide legal counsel and protection against whatever machinations their opponents might attempt, and Cordelia had been struck by the efficiency with which Alexander had moved to safeguard her interests, despite having known her for less than 24 hours. The conversation in the study grew more heated as time passed, Lord Ashworth's voice rising in pitch and volume as his demands were met with Alexander's calm refusals and Mr. Hartwell's precise legal objections, and she found herself torn between gratitude for their protection and guilt at the burden her presence had placed upon their shoulders. Through the thin walls she could hear fragments of the discussion that would determine her future, legal terms and financial obligations discussed with the dispassionate precision of men negotiating the sale of livestock rather than the fate of a human being, and she was reminded once again of how little agency women possessed in a world where their lives could be bartered and sold without their consent or participation. The contracts signed between Lord Ashworth and Sir Edmund Fairfax were indeed legally binding. Mr. Grimsby's voice carried clearly through the intervening walls. And the lady in question has no legal right to refuse a marriage to which her father has already consented in writing. Furthermore, his lordship has expended considerable sums in preparation for this union, costs which must be recovered either through the completion of the marriage or through financial compensation that I suspect the Fairfax family is in no position to provide. The cold calculation in the solicitor's words made Cordelia's blood run cold, for they reduced her rebellion to a matter of breach of contract and financial obligation, transforming her desperate flight from mortal danger into a commercial dispute that could be resolved through negotiation and monetary settlement. Alexander's response was swift and decisive, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of noble blood and the power that came with vast wealth and social position. "Mr. Grimsby," he said with icy politeness that somehow managed to convey more menace than shouted threats, "you seem to be laboring under the misapprehension that Miss Fairfax is a commodity to be bought and sold, rather than a free citizen of England with the right to refuse any marriage that does not meet with her approval. No contract signed by her father can compel a woman to wed against her will, and any attempt to force such a union would constitute kidnapping and assault under English law." The legal battle that ensued was conducted with the civilized veneer that gentlemen maintained even when engaged in the most vicious warfare, each point and counterpoint delivered with perfect courtesy, while the underlying conflict remained as savage as any physical combat. Lord Ashworth's true character began to show through the cracks in his composure as Alexander's refusals continued, his voice taking on the harsh edge that Cordelia recognized from her observations of his treatment of servants and dependents, and she realized that the other men in the room were getting their first glimpse of the monster that lurked beneath his polished exterior. The financial ramifications of the broken engagement were indeed severe, for Sir Edmund had borrowed against the expected marriage settlement to pay his most pressing debts, and the collapse of the union would leave the Fairfax family facing immediate bankruptcy and social ruin that would destroy not only her father but Genevieve as well. This knowledge weighed upon Cordelia's conscience like a stone, for she understood that her salvation had come at a terrible cost to those she loved most, and she found herself questioning whether her flight had been an act of courage or the ultimate selfishness. Yet even as guilt threatened to overwhelm her, she reminded herself of Lady Margaret's fate, and the certainty that Lord Ashworth would have made her life a misery that would have ended only with her death, and she knew that she could not regret choosing life over duty, regardless of the price that others might have to pay for her freedom. The sound of Lord Ashworth's departure came as a relief so profound that Cordelia felt her knees give way beneath her, and she sank into the chair by the window, while tears of exhausted gratitude streamed down her cheeks at the realization that she had survived this first test of her resolve and Alexander's protection. The confrontation had ended without her being dragged back to Ashworth Hall, but she was not naive enough to believe that her former betrothed would simply abandon his pursuit, for she had seen the fury in his pale eyes and heard the promises of retribution in his voice as he was escorted from the premises by Alexander's footman. Mr. Hartwell remained below in urgent conference with his client, their voices a low murmur of legal strategy and contingency planning that reminded her that this was merely the first skirmish in a war that might rage for months or even years before reaching any sort of resolution. She understood now that her presence at Ravenshollow had transformed Alexander from a disinterested observer of social injustice into an active participant in a conflict that could damage his own reputation and standing, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down upon her shoulders like a physical burden that threatened to crush her spirit despite the comfort and safety of her surroundings. The afternoon brought visitors of a very different sort, as the sound of a lighter carriage announced the arrival of a party that made Cordelia's heart leap with joy, even as it filled her with fresh anxiety about the news they might bring from the outside world. From her window, she could see Genevieve descending from the modest conveyance that served the Fairfax family for local travel, her golden hair catching the sunlight that had finally broken through the storm clouds, and her face bearing an expression of such mingled concern and determination that Cordelia felt tears spring to her eyes at the sight of this beloved sister who had risked social censure by coming to see her in her disgrace. Mrs. Mills emerged from the carriage with the dignity and composure that never failed her regardless of the circumstance. Her practical grey travelling dress and neat bonnet, speaking of a woman who faced crisis with calm efficiency rather than hysteria, and Cordelia knew that these two women had come not to condemn her choice, but to understand it and offer whatever support they could provide in the face of social catastrophe. Alexander himself came out to greet the visitors with the courtesy due to ladies regardless of their reduced circumstances, and Cordelia could see from his manner that he recognized their courage in coming to Ravenshollow, despite the scandal that would surely attach to such a visit. The reunion in the morning room was both joyful and heartbreaking, as Genevieve flew into Cordelia's arms with all the impetuosity of youth, while Mrs. Mills watched with the satisfaction of one who had feared she might never see her former charge alive again. "Oh, Cordelia," Genevieve exclaimed as she held her sister tight, "when we heard what had happened at the chapel, I was so frightened that something terrible had befallen you. Papa was beside himself with worry and rage, and the servants were whispering such dreadful things about Lord Ashworth's reaction that I feared he might have harmed you in some way. Mrs. Mills says you were very brave to refuse the marriage, but I confess I do not entirely understand why you would risk everything when the alternative seemed so hopeful and secure." The innocent question cut through Cordelia's heart like a blade. For how could she explain to this sheltered child that security, purchased at the cost of one's life and dignity, was no security at all? That some fates were worse than poverty or social ostracism, and that she had chosen the lesser of two evils rather than the heroic path that Genevieve's romantic imagination had conjured. Mrs. Mills stepped forward with the quiet authority that had made her such an effective governess and companion, her sharp eyes filled with understanding that went far beyond mere sympathy for a difficult situation. "My dear Cordelia," she said gently, "I want you to know that your decision to flee that chapel was not only understandable but necessary, for I had begun to harbour the gravest concerns about Lord Ashworth's character and intentions." The careful phrasing told Cordelia that her former governess had observed far more than she had ever admitted, and the validation of her fears by someone whose judgment she trusted implicitly brought a measure of peace to her troubled conscience. "In recent weeks," Mrs. Mills continued, "I made certain inquiries among the staff at Ashworth Hall through connections in the servants' network, and what I learned convinced me that you were walking toward destruction rather than salvation. The bruises on the kitchen maids, the terrified whispers about his lordship's temper, the suspicious circumstances surrounding poor Lady Margaret's death, all of these things painted a picture of a household ruled by fear rather than proper discipline. I had hoped to find some way to warn you without overstepping the bounds of my position, but you saved yourself through your own courage and intelligence." The news from the outside world was as grim as Cordelia had expected, for society had indeed erupted in scandal and speculation about the runaway bride and the Duke who had aided her escape from a marriage that many still viewed as advantageous, despite the whispers about Lord Ashworth's character. Genevieve's account of their father's reaction was particularly painful, for Sir Edmund's humiliation at the public failure of his arrangements had driven him to blame everyone except himself for the catastrophe, and his rage at Cordelia's defiance was matched only by his terror at the financial ruin that now threatened to engulf the entire family. The cancelled contracts and broken settlements would leave them facing immediate bankruptcy, and the social ostracism that had already begun would make it nearly impossible to arrange alternative marriages for either daughter or to maintain any semblance of their former position in Hampshire society. Yet, despite the gravity of the situation, Cordelia found herself feeling lighter than she had in months, for the burden of living a lie had been lifted from her shoulders, even if the cost of that freedom proved to be higher than she had ever imagined, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as herself, rather than as Lord Ashworth's unwilling wife and eventual victim. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows of Ravenshollow's breakfast room cast dancing shadows across the polished mahogany table where Cordelia sat with Alexander. The simple domestic scene, a stark contrast to the formal, stilted meals she had endured during her brief engagement, when every conversation had been carefully monitored for propriety, and every gesture scrutinized for compliance with Lord Ashworth's exacting standards. Here in this sunlit chamber, with its cheerful yellow walls and arrangements of fresh flowers from the Abbey's gardens, she found herself experiencing something she had never known before: the easy companionship of a man who valued her thoughts and opinions rather than merely her ornamental qualities. And the realization that such partnerships were possible filled her with a wonder that made even the simplest exchange of pleasantries feel like a precious gift. Alexander presided over the breakfast table with none of the pompous ceremony she had observed in other men of his station, his manner warm and inclusive as he inquired about her comfort and shared observations about the estate's daily operations with the natural ease of one who found genuine pleasure in discussing his responsibilities rather than viewing them as tedious burdens to be endured. Their conversations ranged from the practical matters of agricultural innovation and tenant welfare to more abstract discussions of literature and philosophy, and Cordelia found herself astonished by the breadth of his interests and the depth of his understanding of subjects that most gentlemen dismissed as either beneath their notice or too complex for feminine comprehension. When she ventured her own opinions about the management of his charitable schools or the design of new cottages for his workers, he listened with genuine attention rather than the patronizing tolerance she had grown accustomed to receiving from men who considered her education a charming accomplishment rather than a tool for meaningful contribution to important endeavors. Their daily walks through the grounds of Ravenshollow became the highlight of Cordelia's existence at the Abbey, not merely because they provided escape from the confines of indoor spaces, but because they offered opportunities for unguarded conversation that revealed the true character of the man who had rescued her from a fate worse than death. The estate itself was a testament to Alexander's values and vision, its well-maintained paths winding through gardens designed for beauty and utility in equal measure, where productive kitchen gardens nestled alongside ornamental flower beds and ancient trees provided shade for benches placed at intervals for contemplation and rest. She observed how the groundskeepers and gardeners greeted their master with genuine respect rather than fearful deference, how children from the village school ran up to share their lessons and achievements without hesitation or anxiety, and how tenants approached him with concerns and requests, confident that they would receive fair hearing and just consideration. This was a world entirely different from the rigid hierarchy and barely concealed cruelty she had witnessed at Ashworth Hall, where servants scurried about their duties in silence and tenants doffed their caps with eyes cast down in submission rather than meeting their landlord's gaze with the confidence of people who knew themselves to be valued as human beings rather than mere sources of income. The contrast illuminated with painful clarity what her life would have been like as Lady Ashworth, trapped in a household where fear ruled and compassion was seen as weakness to be ruthlessly eliminated in favor of absolute obedience to a master whose word was law regardless of its cruelty or injustice. During these walks, Alexander shared his plans for further improvements to the estate. His enthusiasm for progressive agricultural methods and social reforms, revealing a mind that looked forward to the future rather than clinging to outdated traditions simply because they had always been followed. And Cordelia found herself contributing suggestions and insights that he received with gratitude rather than surprise at her presumption in offering opinions on matters supposedly beyond feminine understanding. When he showed her the new school he had built for the children of his tenants and workers, complete with proper desks and slate boards, and a lending library stocked with books chosen to expand young minds. Rather than merely inculcate obedience to authority, she felt tears spring to her eyes at the evidence of his commitment to improving the lives of those who depended upon him for their livelihood. This is what a marriage should be, she found herself thinking, as they discussed plans for expanding the curriculum to include practical skills alongside traditional subjects, a partnership where both parties contributed their strengths toward common goals that benefited not only themselves, but the entire community under their care. The thought was both exhilarating and heartbreaking, for she understood that such a future could never be hers, given the scandal that surrounded her name and the social barriers that separated a disgraced runaway bride from a duke whose reputation remained unstained by association with her disgrace. Yet even as logic reminded her of the impossibility of their situation, her heart continued to hope that somehow love might prove stronger than social convention, and that the connection growing between them might survive the storms that were sure to follow when their relationship became known to the wider world. The evenings they spent in Alexander's library became sacred time to Cordelia, hours when the outside world with its judgments and complications seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them surrounded by thousands of volumes that represented centuries of human wisdom and achievement. The room itself was a sanctuary of learning and contemplation, its leather-bound books arranged with the care of a scholar rather than the ostentation of a collector, and the comfortable chairs positioned before the fireplace invited long discussions about the ideas and philosophies that shaped their understanding of the world. Alexander proved to be not only well-read, but genuinely thoughtful about the implications of what he studied, approaching literature and history with the same analytical mind he applied to estate management and social reform. And Cordelia discovered that her own education, while more limited in scope due to the constraints placed upon female learning, had prepared her to engage with complex ideas in ways that delighted and surprised him. When she quoted passages from works by Mary Wollstonecraft, or offered critiques of political treatises that challenged conventional wisdom about women's capabilities, he responded with intellectual excitement rather than shocked disapproval, encouraging her to develop her arguments and sharing resources that expanded her understanding of subjects that most men jealously guarded as exclusively masculine domains. These conversations revealed depths of compatibility that went far beyond the surface attraction that had first drawn them together, suggesting the possibility of a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values rather than the unequal dynamic that characterized most marriages of their time and station. It was during one such evening, as rain drummed against the library windows and firelight flickered across the spines of countless books, that Alexander finally shared the full story of his sister Charlotte's tragic fate and the guilt that had haunted him since her death 5 years earlier. His voice grew heavy with emotion as he described the bright, spirited girl who had filled Ravenshollow with laughter until duty and social expectation had demanded her sacrifice to a marriage that promised financial security and social advancement while delivering nothing but misery and early death. "I thought I was protecting her by arranging a match with the Earl of Westbrook," he said quietly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, as if physical tension could somehow ease the emotional burden he carried. His reputation was spotless, his fortune substantial, his lineage impeccable by every measure society uses to judge such things. I never looked deeper, never asked the questions that might have revealed the cruelty hidden beneath his polished exterior. And by the time I realized my mistake, it was too late to save her from the consequences of my failure. The raw pain in his voice moved Cordelia to reach across the space between their chairs and place her hand over his, offering what comfort she could through simple human contact that acknowledged the depth of his suffering, while refusing to let him bear his guilt alone in the darkness of self-recrimination that had consumed too many years of his life already. "Your sister's death was not your fault," she said with quiet conviction that surprised him with its certainty, for she had spent these weeks observing his character and found him incapable of the deliberate cruelty that would make him truly culpable for such a tragedy. "You acted with the best intentions, based on the information available to you, and if society had not conspired to hide the Earl's true nature behind a facade of respectability, you would never have made such a choice for someone you loved. The blame lies with those who enabled his deception and with a system that values wealth and status above human decency, not with a brother who wanted only the best for his sister's future." Her words seemed to reach something deep within his tortured conscience, for she saw his shoulders relax slightly, as if a portion of the burden he had carried for so long was being shared with someone who understood the weight of impossible choices and their unintended consequences. The tragedy that had shaped his determination to protect her from Lord Ashworth's predations was revealed in all its complexity, showing her that his intervention in her crisis had been motivated not merely by chivalrous impulse, but by a desperate need to prevent another innocent woman from suffering the fate that had claimed Charlotte's life through his failure to see past society's carefully constructed lies about character and virtue. As the fire burned lower in the grate and the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, Cordelia found herself sharing her own struggles with the weight of family responsibility and the crushing burden of being valued primarily as a commodity to be traded for financial advantage rather than a person deserving of consideration and care. She spoke of the gradual realization that her father's love, while genuine, was conditional upon her willingness to sacrifice her own welfare for the family's benefit, and of the terrible loneliness of knowing that her feelings and fears mattered less than the practical considerations that governed their reduced circumstances. The parallel between their experiences, despite the vast difference in their social positions, created a bond that transcended the usual barriers between men and women of their time, and she began to understand that their connection was built upon something more substantial than mere attraction or gratitude for rescue from an unwanted marriage. They were two souls who had learned through painful experience that duty without love was a form of spiritual death, that compliance with social expectations could exact a price too high for any reasonable person to pay, and that sometimes the greatest courage was required not to do what was expected, but to follow one's conscience even when the consequences promised to be severe. The growing affection between them was evident to everyone in the household, though none would have been so presumptuous as to comment directly upon the obvious attraction that sparked whenever they were in the same room. Mrs. Whitmore watched with the shrewd eye of one who had served the family for decades, and understood the subtle signs that indicated her master's heart was finally healing from the wounds inflicted by his sister's death, while the other servants went about their duties with the cheerful efficiency of people who sensed that their employer had found something worth protecting and nurturing in the quiet young woman who had arrived at their door like a refugee from a storm. Cordelia found herself treasuring every moment of companionship and every sign of Alexander's growing regard, even as she understood that such happiness was almost certainly temporary, and that the real world beyond Raven's Hollow's protective walls would eventually intrude with demands and complications that might destroy whatever chance they had of building a future together. The scandal of her flight from Lord Ashworth's altar would follow her for years, making any honourable man think twice before associating his name with hers. And the disparity in their social positions created additional obstacles that love alone might not be sufficient to overcome. Yet even knowing that their time together was precious precisely because it could not last indefinitely, she found herself hoping against hope that somehow they might find a way to transform their mutual healing into something permanent and lasting, a partnership that would honor both Charlotte's memory and her own hard-won freedom while creating the kind of marriage that exemplified the best of human possibility rather than the worst of social convenience. The poison of Lord Ashworth's revenge spread through Hampshire society with the relentless efficiency of plague. Each whispered innuendo and carefully planted rumor designed to destroy not only Cordelia's already damaged reputation, but to drag Alexander down with her into a mire of scandal that would taint the ancient honor of the Ravenshollow name for generations to come. The campaign began subtly, as such things always did among the upper classes, with casual observations dropped into conversations at card parties and dinner gatherings about the peculiar circumstances that had brought a runaway bride to shelter under the Duke's roof, and the remarkable generosity he had shown to a young woman whose character was now so thoroughly in question. Lord Ashworth, his pale eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction whenever he encountered former guests from the failed wedding, took particular pleasure in expressing his deep concern for Alexander's reputation, while simultaneously implying that such concern was already far too late to preserve either the Duke's standing or Miss Fairfax's non-existent virtue. The whispers grew bolder with each retelling, transforming Cordelia's desperate flight from danger into a calculated abandonment of duty in favor of an illicit liaison with a man whose wealth and position made him a more attractive prospect than her legally contracted husband, and painting Alexander as either a naive fool taken in by a scheming adventuress or a calculating seducer who had deliberately undermined another man's engagement for his own gratification. The truth of her genuine terror and his honorable rescue became lost in a web of speculation that fed upon itself, until even those who had never met either party felt qualified to render judgment upon their characters and motivations. The financial pressure that Lord Ashworth brought to bear upon the Fairfax family proved even more devastating than his assault upon their reputations, for he possessed both the influence and the vindictive nature necessary to ensure that every avenue of potential relief was systematically closed to them. Sir Edmund found that creditors who had previously been willing to extend his deadlines suddenly demanded immediate payment in full, that potential buyers for family property disappeared without explanation, and that friends who might have offered assistance grew mysteriously unavailable whenever he called upon them for aid. The man's reach extended far beyond Hampshire into the financial centres of London, where his connections among bankers and moneylenders created a web of influence that trapped the Fairfax family in an ever-tightening noose of debt and desperation. Genevieve, innocent and trusting as she was, could not understand why former friends crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her presence, or why invitations to social gatherings that had once arrived regularly now ceased entirely, leaving her isolated and confused in a world that had suddenly turned hostile without apparent reason. Mrs. Mills, with her greater understanding of how society operated and the cruel machinery of reputation that could crush the innocent along with the guilty, watched these developments with growing alarm while maintaining the calm facade that had served her through decades of navigating the treacherous waters of upper-class employment. She understood that Lord Ashworth's campaign was designed not merely to punish Cordelia for her defiance, but to create conditions so intolerable for her family that she would be forced to return to him voluntarily in order to save those she loved from complete destruction. The attack upon Genevieve's prospects proved to be the masterpiece of Ashworth's strategy. For he understood with the cunning of a predator exactly which pressure would prove most effective in breaking Cordelia's resolve to remain free from his control. Word began to circulate among the families with eligible sons that Miss Genevieve Fairfax, while undeniably beautiful and accomplished, came from a family marked by scandal and instability that made any alliance with them questionable at best and potentially ruinous at worst. The whispered suggestions that moral corruption might run in the bloodline, that a sister who could abandon her duty and honor so completely might have passed those same dangerous tendencies to her sibling, created a miasma of suspicion that clung to Genevieve wherever she went, and effectively destroyed any chance she might have had of making an advantageous marriage that could restore the family's fortunes. Young gentlemen who had previously shown interest in her company now avoided her as if she carried some contagious disease, while their mothers made pointed comments about the importance of choosing wives from families of unquestionable virtue and stability. The cruelest blow came when Lord Pemberton, who had been on the verge of offering for Genevieve's hand before the scandal erupted, publicly announced his engagement to another young lady, whose family connections were more suitable to his position and aspirations, leaving no doubt about the reason for his change of heart. Cordelia, learning of these developments through carefully worded letters from Mrs. Mills, felt each reversal as a physical blow that made her question whether her escape from Lord Ashworth's clutches had been worth the price that others were being forced to pay for her freedom. The knowledge that her continued presence at Ravenshollow was bringing disaster not only upon her own family, but potentially upon Alexander as well, drove Cordelia to contemplate solutions that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier, when her greatest fear had been the prospect of marrying a man she despised and feared. Now she found herself considering possibilities that would have once seemed like the stuff of Gothic novels rather than practical options for a gently bred young woman with limited resources and no independent means of support. The idea of fleeing to the continent, perhaps to France, where English social conventions held less sway, and a woman of education might find employment as a governess or companion without the weight of scandal following her every step, began to seem not only feasible, but necessary if she wished to preserve what remained of her family's hopes for recovery. She had heard whispered stories of other women who had disappeared from English society under similar circumstances, some finding refuge in convents or schools for young ladies where their past could be carefully forgotten, others creating entirely new identities in foreign cities where no one knew their histories or the mistakes that had driven them into exile. The prospect of such a future, lonely and uncertain as it would undoubtedly be, seemed preferable to remaining at Ravenshollow as a source of continued embarrassment and danger to the man who had shown her such undeserved kindness and protection. The practical arrangements for such a departure would be complex, but not impossible, for Cordelia had discovered that her education, while designed primarily to make her an attractive wife rather than a self-sufficient individual, had nevertheless equipped her with skills that might prove marketable in the right circumstances. Her fluency in French and Italian, her musical accomplishments, and her knowledge of literature and history could potentially qualify her for positions that would provide modest but adequate income while allowing her to maintain some degree of independence and dignity. The jewelry that Alexander had insisted she keep from her broken engagement, despite her protests that she had no right to Lord Ashworth's gifts, could be sold to provide the funds necessary for travel and initial establishment in whatever sanctuary she might find, and she had already begun making discreet inquiries about transportation to the major ports from which ships departed regularly for the continent. Mrs. Whitmore, with the intuitive understanding that came from decades of observing human nature, had begun to notice signs of restlessness and secret planning in her young guest's behavior, though she was too well trained to comment directly upon matters that were not her business to discuss. The housekeeper's growing concern about Cordelia's state of mind led her to increase her surveillance of the young woman's activities, and it was this vigilance that ultimately led to the discovery of letters and travel documents hidden in Cordelia's chamber that revealed the extent of her plans for disappearing from their lives entirely. Alexander's discovery of Cordelia's intention to leave Ravenshollow came through Mrs. Whitmore's reluctant revelation of what she had observed, and his reaction to the news was swift and decisive in a way that surprised even him with its intensity. The thought of losing her now, just when he had begun to hope that they might find a way to build a future together, despite the obstacles that society had placed in their path, filled him with a desperation that made him understand how his own suffering over Charlotte's death had paled in comparison to the agony of potentially losing someone whose presence had become essential to his happiness and sense of purpose. He found Cordelia in the library where they had spent so many evenings sharing thoughts and dreams, and the sight of her sitting quietly among the books that had witnessed the growth of their affection made his heart clench with the terrible possibility that these peaceful moments might soon become nothing more than memories to sustain him through years of solitude and regret. When he confronted her about her plans, his voice betraying more emotion than he had intended to reveal, she met his gaze with the calm resignation of someone who had already made peace with a decision that would cost her everything she had come to value most in the world. "I cannot continue to allow my presence here to destroy everything and everyone I care about," she said quietly. Her hands folded in her lap, with the composure that had become second nature during her weeks of learning to navigate impossible situations with grace and dignity. "Lord Ashworth's campaign against my family grows more vicious with each passing day, and now I hear that whispers have begun about your own reputation and the impropriety of sheltering a woman whose character has been so thoroughly blackened by scandal and speculation. You have already sacrificed too much for my sake, and I will not stand by while your generosity is repaid with the destruction of the honor and standing that your family has maintained for generations." Alexander felt his heart break at the nobility of her sacrifice, even as fury rose within him at the injustice of a world that would force such a choice upon someone who had already suffered so much for the crime of refusing to submit to cruelty and abuse. Her willingness to disappear rather than continue to burden him with the consequences of her presence revealed the depth of her character, while simultaneously demonstrating how little she understood about the transformation that her love had worked in his own heart and priorities. "You speak of sacrifice and protection as if your happiness means nothing compared to the opinions of people whose approval I neither need nor want," he replied with a passion that surprised them both with its intensity. "Do you truly believe that I would find contentment in a reputation purchased at the cost of your exile and misery, or that the honor of my name could survive the knowledge that I had allowed the woman I love to disappear into uncertain danger rather than fight for our right to choose our own path together?" His declaration of love hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning the chasm of their different circumstances, and Cordelia felt tears spring to her eyes at the precious gift of hearing words she had never dared to hope he might speak, despite the growing tenderness she had observed in his treatment of her. Yet even as her heart rejoiced at this confirmation of feelings she had hardly dared to acknowledge in her own breast, her practical mind continued to catalogue the obstacles that would make any future together seem impossible to achieve without destroying both their lives in the attempt. The argument that followed revealed depths of feeling and understanding that surprised them both, as years of careful emotional control gave way to honest expression of fears and desires that had been hidden beneath layers of duty and social expectation. Alexander's terror of losing another person he loved to the cruel machinery of social convention battled against Cordelia's ingrained belief that her own happiness was less important than the welfare of those who depended upon her protection, and their words grew heated as each tried to convince the other that love alone might not be sufficient to overcome the forces arrayed against them. Yet even in the midst of their disagreement, they began to understand that their feelings had grown beyond the desperate gratitude and protective instinct that had initially drawn them together into something deeper and more lasting. A partnership based upon mutual respect and genuine compatibility that could survive the storms of scandal and social disapproval if they possessed the courage to fight for it together, rather than allowing fear to drive them apart. When Cordelia finally admitted that her plans for Exel were motivated as much by her own terror of bringing him to ruin as by concern for her family's welfare, Alexander realized that her willingness to sacrifice herself yet again was not the nobility he had initially perceived, but another form of the self-doubt that had been instilled in her by years of being valued primarily as a commodity rather than a person deserving of love and protection for her own sake. The evidence that would ultimately destroy Lord Ashworth's carefully constructed facade of respectability came not through dramatic confrontation or public accusation, but through the methodical investigation that Alexander's wealth and connections made possible. A careful accumulation of testimony and documentation that painted an undeniable portrait of systematic cruelty stretching back years before Lady Margaret's suspicious death. Mr. Benedict Hartwell had assembled a team of the finest investigators London could provide. Men whose discretion was matched only by their skill at uncovering truths that powerful people preferred to keep buried, and their patient work had yielded a treasure trove of evidence that would have seen Lord Ashworth facing criminal charges if justice operated equally for all men, regardless of their wealth and station. The physician who had attended Lady Margaret during her final illness had kept private notes detailing injuries that were inconsistent with the accidental falls that supposedly caused them, while servants who had fled Ashworth Hall in terror over the years had finally found the courage to speak when promised protection from their former master's retribution. Most damning of all was the testimony of a young maid who had witnessed the violent argument that preceded Lady Margaret's death, her detailed account of what she had seen and heard providing the missing pieces of a puzzle that transformed suspicion into certainty about the true nature of the first Lady Ashworth's demise. The evidence was so compelling that even Lord Ashworth's most influential allies began to distance themselves from association with him, for no amount of wealth or social position could protect a man from the consequences of such overwhelming proof of his monstrous nature. Alexander's campaign to expose the truth about Lord Ashworth was conducted with the strategic brilliance that had made him one of the most respected landowners in England, each revelation carefully timed and placed to achieve maximum impact while protecting those who had shown courage in coming forward with their testimony. The first whispers began in the gentlemen's clubs of London, where Alexander's own impeccable reputation lent weight to the carefully chosen words he shared with influential friends about disturbing discoveries regarding a certain peer whose character had been called into serious question by new evidence. From there, the information spread through the interconnected network of political and social relationships that bound the upper classes together, each recipient adding their own observations about Lord Ashworth's behavior and temperament to create a growing chorus of concern about his fitness for the position and privileges he enjoyed. The revelation that Lady Margaret's death might not have been the tragic accident it had appeared to be sent shockwaves through Hampshire society, transforming Lord Ashworth from a respectable if stern gentleman into a figure of suspicion and revulsion whose very presence at social gatherings became an embarrassment that hostesses could no longer ignore. The careful documentation of his treatment of servants and tenants, combined with accounts of his financial dealings that bordered on criminal fraud, created a comprehensive picture of corruption that made his pursuit of Cordelia appear not as the righteous anger of a wronged man, but as the desperate attempt of a predator to reclaim prey that had escaped his clutches through her own courage and intelligence. The transformation in public opinion regarding Cordelia's flight from the altar was swift and decisive once the truth about Lord Ashworth's character became widely known, for society that had been quick to condemn her supposed fickleness was equally eager to embrace the more romantic narrative of a brave young woman who had escaped a terrible fate through her own intuition and determination. Ladies who had previously whispered about her shameful behavior now spoke admiringly of her courage in defying social convention to preserve her own life, while gentlemen who had questioned Alexander's wisdom in sheltering her began to praise his chivalrous protection of an innocent victim. The same drawing rooms that had buzzed with speculation about improper conduct now rang with expressions of sympathy for the ordeal she had endured, and admiration for the strength of character that had enabled her to recognize danger despite the pressures to ignore her instincts in favor of family duty and social expectation. Invitations that had been withdrawn from the Fairfax family began to arrive again, accompanied by notes expressing regret for any misunderstanding and hope that past slights might be forgiven in light of new information that cast recent events in an entirely different light. Genevieve found herself restored to her former position in Hampshire society, with young gentlemen once again competing for her attention and their mothers speaking approvingly of her family's honorable behavior in supporting their daughter's difficult but ultimately correct decision to refuse an unsuitable marriage. The securing of Genevieve's future became one of Alexander's priorities as he worked to undo the damage that Lord Ashworth's campaign of revenge had inflicted upon the Fairfax family. For he understood that Cordelia's peace of mind depended upon knowing that her sister would not suffer permanent consequences for the stand she had taken against injustice and cruelty. Using his extensive network of connections and his own considerable fortune, he quietly arranged for Sir Edmund's most pressing debts to be settled and for investment opportunities to be made available that would gradually restore the family's financial stability without the charity that might wound their pride or create obligations that could not be honorably discharged. More importantly, he used his influence to ensure that Genevieve's reputation was not only restored, but enhanced by the revelation of her family's moral courage, positioning her as one of the most desirable young ladies in Hampshire society, whose beauty was matched by the integrity that had been demonstrated through their recent trials. When Lord Pemberton, clearly hoping to repair his own reputation after his shabby treatment of Genevieve during the height of the scandal, approached Sir Edmund about renewing his suit for her hand, he was politely but firmly informed that his previous behavior had disqualified him from consideration, and that the family would prefer to seek connections with gentlemen whose character was more consistently honorable regardless of changing circumstances. The satisfaction of delivering this rejection was one of the few pleasant moments Sir Edmund had experienced in months, for it allowed him to demonstrate the same kind of principled stand that his daughter had taken when she refused to proceed with her marriage to Lord Ashworth. Lord Ashworth himself became a figure of such social disgrace that his continued presence in Hampshire became untenable, the weight of accumulated evidence and universal condemnation forcing him to retreat to his London properties, where his movements were watched by investigators and his activities monitored by those who sought to prevent any further harm to potential victims. The legal proceedings that Alexander had initiated were designed not merely to clear Cordelia's name, but to ensure that Lord Ashworth faced genuine consequences for his crimes, though the intricacies of English law and the protection that wealth could still provide meant that justice would be measured in social ruin and financial penalty rather than the criminal prosecution that his actions truly deserved. The revelation of his complicity in Lady Margaret's death, while stopping short of formal murder charges, was sufficient to destroy his standing completely and to serve as a warning to other men who might believe that position and privilege granted them license to abuse those under their power. For Cordelia, learning that her instincts about the man had been not only correct, but had likely saved her life, brought a sense of vindication that helped heal the wounds inflicted by months of doubt and social condemnation, while the knowledge that other potential victims would be protected by the exposure of his true nature gave meaning to the suffering she had endured in breaking free from his control. The proposal that Alexander offered to Cordelia came not in a moment of high drama or desperate emotion, but during one of their quiet evening conversations in the library, where the deepest truths of their relationship had always been explored among the books that had witnessed the growth of their affection from grateful dependency to genuine partnership. He had chosen to speak not from a position of romantic superiority or protective authority, but as an equal partner seeking to formalize a union that already existed in all but legal terms, and his words reflected the understanding and respect that had characterized their relationship from its earliest moments at Ravenshollow Abbey. "My dearest Cordelia," he said as they sat before the fire that had become the backdrop for so many meaningful exchanges, "I find myself hoping that you might consider making permanent the partnership that has brought such unexpected joy and purpose to both our lives. I offer not rescue or protection, for you have proven yourself quite capable of protecting yourself when necessary, but rather the opportunity to build together the kind of marriage that honors both our past struggles and our shared dreams for the future." His proposal was both romantic and practical, acknowledging the trials that had brought them together while looking forward to the possibilities that awaited them as partners in every sense of the word, and Cordelia felt her heart overflow with gratitude not only for his love, but for his understanding of her need to be valued as an equal rather than protected as a dependent. When she accepted his offer with tears of joy, rather than the desperate relief that had characterized so many of her recent decisions, she knew that she was choosing not merely safety or security, but the chance to create something beautiful and meaningful with a man who saw her as she truly was and loved her, not despite her flaws and fears, but because of the strength and courage that her trials had revealed. The wedding that took place 6 months after Cordelia's flight from Lord Ashworth's altar was everything that the previous ceremony had not been, a celebration of genuine love and mutual commitment that transformed the simple vows into something sacred and profound rather than merely legal and binding. The ceremony was held in the village church of Ravenshollow rather than a private chapel, open to the entire community that had come to love and respect their Duke's chosen bride, and the atmosphere was one of joy and blessing rather than the oppressive dread that had characterized her first attempt at marriage. Cordelia wore a gown of ivory silk that she had chosen herself, its simple elegance reflecting her own refined taste rather than the elaborate display that had been designed to showcase Lord Ashworth's wealth and her father's social aspirations, and the orange blossoms in her hair were picked fresh from the Abbey's gardens by her own hands rather than arranged by servants following someone else's instructions. Genevieve served as her only attendant, radiant with happiness for her sister's genuine joy, and secure in her own future that had been restored through the revelation of truth and the exercise of justice, while Mrs. Mills watched from the front pew with the satisfaction of one who had always believed that courage and integrity would ultimately be rewarded, despite the temporary triumph of cruelty and deception. Sir Edmund, his own pride restored through his family's vindication and his debts relieved through Alexander's generous assistance, walked his eldest daughter to the altar with genuine pleasure rather than the desperate relief that had marked his previous attempt to see her married, and his voice was steady and strong as he placed her hand in that of the man who had proven himself worthy of such a precious trust. The vows they exchanged were the traditional words that had bound countless couples throughout the centuries, but spoken with such evident sincerity and deep emotion that even the most hardened hearts in the congregation were moved to tears by the obvious love and commitment that transformed familiar phrases into declarations of personal devotion that would guide their partnership through whatever trials the future might bring. Alexander's promise to love and cherish her carried the weight of a man who understood the true meaning of such commitments, while Cordelia's vow to honor and keep him reflected not the submission that society expected from wives, but the voluntary offering of a strong woman who had chosen her partner from love rather than duty or necessity. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed not by reluctant observers fulfilling social obligation, but by friends and neighbors who had come to celebrate the triumph of love over the forces that would have destroyed their happiness, and the blessing that fell upon them felt like divine approval for a union that had been forged through trial and tempered by understanding. The wedding breakfast that followed was held at Ravenshollow Abbey, where the same rooms that had sheltered Cordelia during her time of greatest need now hosted the celebration of her new beginning as the Duchess of Ravenshollow, a title she would wear with dignity and use to help other women find the courage to claim their own freedom from situations that threatened their happiness and their very lives. In the years that followed their marriage, Cordelia and Alexander created exactly the kind of partnership that they had dreamed of during those long evenings in the library, working together to improve the lives of their tenants and neighbors while using their combined influence to support reforms that would protect the vulnerable from exploitation and abuse. The Duchess of Ravenshollow became known throughout England for her work with charitable organizations that assisted women escaping dangerous marriages and situations, while the Duke's political influence was consistently employed to support legislation that would provide legal protections for those who had previously been powerless against the whims of cruel masters and husbands. Their marriage became a model of what such unions could be when based upon genuine affection and mutual respect rather than mere financial advantage or social climbing, and their obvious happiness served as an inspiration to other couples who dared to hope that love might prove stronger than convention. Standing in the same library where they had first shared their deepest thoughts and fears, Cordelia often reflected upon the rainy day when she had fled from one altar in terror and found her true future waiting in a ducal carriage, understanding now that the most frightening steps forward sometimes led to the greatest happiness, and that the courage to reject what was wrong could open the door to everything that was right and beautiful and worth fighting to preserve. The storm that had driven her from Lord Ashworth's chapel to Alexander's protection had been the herald not of destruction, but of the dawn of a new life built upon the foundation of love freely given and gratefully received, proving that sometimes the darkest moments served only to make the light that followed all the more precious and bright.